bears, bees, blood, and possibly the greatest rescue involving cakes ever. Join me as I talk Artemis with special guest Dr. Carla Ionescu on the Ancient History Hound podcast. Hi and welcome, my name's Neil, and as you've probably worked out, this is a guest episode, and in this one I'm joined by Dr. Ionescu to talk about Artemis, who is the subject of her new book, She Who Hunts. Dr. Carla Ionescu is a Romanian refugee who escaped the communist regime with her family when she was 10 years old. She is also an adrenaline junkie, an animal lover, and a natural-born storyteller. She likes to ride motorcycles real fast and research through archival documents very carefully. Carla's research is focused on the influential nature of Artemis both in the Greek world and in Ephesus. Her recent book, She Who Hunts, Artemis, the Goddess Who Changed the World, is a comprehensive compilation of all things Artemis, filled with examples of ritual, symbolism, and cultural folklore. As one of the leading experts in the worship and ritual of Artemis, Dr. Ionescu spends most of her time teaching in the field of ancient history and women's studies, and constructing the Artemis Center, a virtual and eventual physical platform where everyone can learn, collaborate, and enjoy stories of mythology and ritual culture. Carla hopes to run the center full-time, create adventures in goddess travel, and share all of her new discoveries with everyone who is passionate about ancient spiritualities and the mysteries of the divine feminine. So what then can you expect from our chat? Well, in our discussion, we covered a range of topics. For example, the various cults and how she was worshipped. As you'll hear, this varied hugely. There was also the matter of her depiction and her representation. Trust me when I say that the common depiction of Artemis isn't the only one. She's a deity, as you'll hear, with a range of associations ranging from the violent to the poignant. The episode notes for this will be on ancientblogger.com, but there isn't a transcription. However, there are links to Dr. Ionescu's social media, her book, and her podcast, as well as a few other bits which we mention in our conversation. I'll also stick a cake recipe on there. It crops up towards the end of our chat, and trust me, it's worth it. Now, just before we start this episode, it does include reference to violence and blood, just in case you needed to know. If you have half as much fun listening to this as I did chatting with Dr. Ionescu, then you're in for a treat. And thanks again for taking the time to download and listen. I really hope you enjoy it, and feel free to get in touch and give us some feedback. Right, here we go. Hi, Dr. Ionescu, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Neil. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. I read about your book and obviously what you do and thought I've got to talk to you about it. The first question I've got actually relates to this. And I often ask it to guests, how did you get into ancient history, and what brought you specifically to Artemis?
And this is a great question. I get it a lot, although it does take me a while to explain, because when I first went to university, I was thinking I was going to be a lawyer or a psychiatrist. It was much more, I was obsessed with law and other things. So it had nothing to do with ancient history other than like just my passion as a kid with mythology, like most of us, right? So I did go to school. I did go to uni, and I got my first degree in psych, and I worked in a pharmaceutical company for a little bit, and that was terrible. And then I came back to school and I got my degree in like English and law. And I thought I'd want to go to law school, and I tried a couple of legal courses, and that was just too dry for me. It was no Law and Order kind of stuff. And so then I came back to school and I said, what's really interesting to me? And so religion was interesting to me, and ritual, and ancient history has always been interesting. So I said, okay, let me give this a try. And so I got a degree in religion, and like religion and classics.
Yeah.
And then my father's like, what are you going to do with this degree? So there wasn't much I could do with this degree. So I went to get my master's. And it was in the master's that they ask you to start focusing on something, right? So I began doing, because I grew up Roman Catholic, I began doing my master's on the Virgin Mary. And
Right.
then one of the things that I started doing is just tracing her back, like tracing the rituals, the practices back. And I bumped into Artemis a couple of times. So I was like, this is really fascinating. Why does she keep showing up everywhere I'm turning? She keeps showing up, the Mediterranean, everywhere. And so I did a short paper on how Artemis connects to the Virgin Mary. And then my supervisor had said, this is a really good idea. Perhaps you might want to delve into it a bit deeper because nothing's really been done specifically about Artemis.
Hmm.
Like the Virgin Mary has been associated with other goddesses in the past, but not really Artemis. So then I applied to get my PhD. But before I applied to get my PhD, I went on a trip and I wanted to see, it was my first time I went to Greece and Turkey and everything. And she just kept showing up to me in the most random places. Like the statue of Artemis itself. Like we would be walking in a garden, and she would be right there, which like a random garden that you never expect the statue of Artemis of Ephesus to show up. Or we would be going somewhere, and there would be a painting of her just randomly in a restaurant, or and I just started to feel a bit haunted. I was like, what is happening here? I've never seen this goddess in this way before in all my other travels. And so I kind of felt called to it. Yeah. So then I came back
Hmm.
and began my work. And as I began to work very seriously on sort of finding her roots and tracing her back, I realized that she was quite underestimated, quite overlooked. And then it became a commitment, a determination that I would speak about her um, within academia in a way that I felt she wasn't spoken about before. So that was it. I became an Artemis stan
Yeah.
for life.
Well, that's quite a story. And I think it's really important because many people, and I've said this before, have this perception about ancient history and the classics, call it what you want, that you must be translating Cicero at the age of 5.
Mm,
And that otherwise you're just never going to get in there. And I think if you listen, or if you're someone who's listening to this and has listened to previous guest episodes, I think you'll find a pattern of people who are doing all sorts of things, and they end up loving or falling in love with ancient history, and then find a niche or an area of it which they really, really find traction with, and then it becomes their thing. I know that you are a fellow podcaster,
yes.
and I know you've got a bunch load of other stuff. So before we go any further, can you tell us if people want to get in touch with you and talk to you about Artemis, how they can do that, how they can access your other content?
Okay. Yes. Thank you. So I do. So I've just started a podcast this year. So I'm a bit new to the podcasting world. And it's called the Goddess Project Podcast. It's on YouTube and also like I have a Twitter and Instagram account. And I started it because I just wanted to talk about stuff and especially like connections, both in the ancient and modern world, that
Mm,
I don't really get to talk about as much in academia or in my classes.
no.
And so I felt like here is a platform where I can just talk about all, like, did you see this connection? Then do you see how this fits here? And look at this. And all the things that interest me and fascinate me, I could be talking about that and sharing with others. So I began that podcast in March. And actually, this coming up week will be our season finale, my season finale.
Oh, congrats.
uh, yeah, thanks. And then I'm going to take a little break and start again, season two. I've already made a list for season two. And as far as Artemis stuff, I'm sort of everywhere online under Artemis Expert. So when I publish my book, actually, I should say that my book, She
Oh,
Who
yeah.
Hunts,
Yeah.
on Artemis, the goddess who changed the world. When I published my book, the publisher said, one of your things is that you don't have like a brand, right?
Mm.
Because here I am, just professor at school. What do I know about building a brand for myself, right? Like I'm a bit old school in that way. I'm like, eh. And so she said to me, you need to have the same name everywhere. You need to pick a name. You need to stick with it. You need to do all these things. So across the board, it's Artemis Expert on all the platforms, and anybody could DM or send questions or anything like that.
Yeah, you'll find the links to much of what you do, or where people can find you, on the episode notes for this podcast, and that's always at ancientblogger.com. There'll be links to your book, links to your podcast, where people can find you on Instagram and other social media. So,
Thank you.
oh yeah, your book. Full disclosure, I bought your book. I wasn't given a free copy or anything, and I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you.
We're going to talk about Artemis. We're going to talk about her in a number of different contexts across a number of different locations. If you can just tell us and just give a brief overview, who was she? What were her main associations, her attributes? And then we can go about looking at everything else.
Okay. All right. So Artemis, the Greek Artemis during the classical period, I would say was most famously known as the huntress or the hunter or the archer, also most famously known as the twin sister of Apollo, associated with the moon. And I would say her attributes, and she was worshipped throughout the Mediterranean, although that will take us into a more detailed sort of discussion. But let's say, for summary's sake, that she was worshipped across the Mediterranean during this period as a both as a huntress, as a mistress of animals, and perhaps as a goddess of childbirth, and protector of young anything, young women, young men, young animals. And her attributes are, I mean, obviously the bow and arrow. She always has hounds with her, sometimes deers, in the past lions, and the bear, which we're going to talk about. The bear actually is not depicted with her in sculpture,
Oh,
but she is, as we'll talk about, she is very associated with bears, which is interesting. Now that I'm thinking of it, I'm thinking I can't recall a statue of her with a bear. I don't know if you can. I can't.
no, I'm trying to think of
Right?
one.
That's
Generally
interesting.
speaking, it's a deer.
Yes,
She's got the quiver over her shoulder, always a very sort of floaty, I think it's a chiton type
that's right.
outfit,
That's right.
and like you say, a dog. I don't
Hmm.
know if perhaps a bear is something that would be artistically difficult.
True. True.
It's possible. I know that when people look at vases and when people examine vases, they forget sometimes that there is an artistic representation challenge there and whether or not.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean that they may not have tried. It might be
Hmm.
that just hasn't survived. We don't have
Hmm.
it. Doesn't mean it didn't
Hmm.
exist. That's a good question. If anyone out there's listening, they know, yes, I can definitely point to a reference of Artemis with a bear that's depicted visually somewhere. Get in touch. Let us know. That'd be
Yes,
really, really good.
absolutely. Hmm.
So thanks very much for that summary. In terms of the other deities, did she play well with them? Did she get on? Is there much of an interaction? Was she famously associated with some more than others? Or
So I would say she is traditionally associated with her brother, of course. And often, even for example, in Pompeii comes to mind right away, or other I'm trying to think of a couple other places. I think at Samos as well. There is often depictions of the both of them almost like on opposite sides of temple walls.
right?
So there's a few scenes like that. She's and often when she's out like killing people, for example, when they were killing Niobe's children, they go together, or when they go and take
Hmm.
a when they avenge their mother, they go together. So she is almost often associated or best associated with her brother Apollo. Um, does she play well with others? I think one of the things about Artemis that's really fascinating is how independent she is. I mean,
Mm,
as a child, we have that story where she sits on Zeus's lap and says, I want this many maidens. I want this city. I want to have this, this, this. And I never want anyone to bother me, and I don't have to worry about anything. And Zeus goes, yeah, okay, you can have everything you want, right? But like so she wouldn't be closer to her supposed sisters like Athena and Aphrodite. I don't like they don't hang out.
mm,
She doesn't always get along with Hera. I'm
mm.
trying to think who else is in there. Ares, Hephaestus. So she is a very independent, she's sort of the if this was a family, I mean, we think of them as a family in a way. She's sort of that kid that does her own thing, or that person that
Mm,
does her own thing, that
mm.
sister that is off in another country doing some other thing. And um so I would say she gets along with the others more than not, but again, is very, very independent, uh, and is not attached to them, other
The
than her brother every now and then.
the point you made about her sitting on Zeus's lap is actually,
Mhm.
I can sort of offers a neat little segue. There's an episode in the Iliad. Zeus goes, gloves off, guys, have at it, and they all
That's
say,
right.
right, let's get down there. The first thing is going to shout out to Athena because Athena just drops Ares. Athena just gets a boulder, bang, puts him down, and
Yep.
then Aphrodite turns up to drag him away. She goes over and just, yeah, again, I'm not advocating violence against deities, but she does. She puts her down as well, drops Aphrodite, and then Hera turns up, and Hera gets hold of Artemis. And the description is quite comical, I think, because
Mhm.
she says she gets both of her wrists in one hand and gets her bow and quiver and just that old phrase boxes her around the ears with it. It's basically just beats
Mhm.
her up using her own
That's right.
iconography. And
Hmm.
then after that, Artemis is, "I'm out, I've gone," and she goes back and complains to Zeus, and sort of she's at his knees complaining, and Zeus is by this point just laughing about it all. I mean, he's just that
Right.
kind of he's playing a part of that family member at a big event who stirred it up and is sat back watching it and loving it. And
Uh-huh.
it's something again I hadn't noticed that level of detail. Every time I read the Iliad, I find something I haven't previously noticed, which might be my lack of attention, but I think it speaks to the fact that the text is so deep that it does give you those extra details and it rewards you every time you read it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's a very motherly moment in a way for Hera. It's a very disappointed mother or angry mother
Mm,
kind of moment. We normally see Hera so much in the wife role, right? The nagging, jealous wife role. But I think every now and then we get to see her, well, and she's sometimes also the evil stepmother, but we get to see her a bit in that mother role. But Artemis does not take that well. No,
no. But
no.
that's a really good point you make, though. I hadn't thought of that. Whereas, Athena picks up a rock and just drops Ares. That's full on within the context of war, because in the Iliad, again, you have that a few times. People injure and kill each other using boulders.
Hmm.
Whereas the way that Artemis is sort of told off is kind of reminiscent.
Right.
I had my ears boxed by my mum, as it were,
That's right. Me too.
I know she doesn't listen to my podcast, so I can say that. Uh, it's
That's right.
exactly what Artemis gets. It's we've got the idea, or a rough idea rather, of Artemis in the classical period, and
Hmm.
obviously as she's appeared in the Iliad. What was she, or what were her origins prior to classical Greece, and where else do we see her? Do we find her in the other parts of the Mediterranean? If so, where and how?
So that's actually a very complicated question for Artemis because as I dug deeper and deeper into her traditions, it seems that her roots are almost like if you can imagine a tree roots that is it spreads everywhere. So every little bit
Hmm.
of tradition can be associated with her, and I think that that's because her pre sort of Greek persona was mistress of animals, and
Yeah,
almost every culture, certainly in the European, even the Middle East and other areas, has a mistress of animals or a,
yeah.
a goddess of the wild, right? And so that is difficult to pinpoint down and say, okay, well, she started here.
Hmm.
So for the purpose of the book and for myself, we go back to the mistress of animals, and then we try to connect her to different areas. So for example, Minoan, the Minoan traditions have a mistress of the wild or a mistress of animals. And so one of my favorite actually connections to her is that way. Kaibali, again, is sort of a more mothering
Hmm.
figure, but she is also, she has lions and tigers and bears and, as part of her cult as well. Hecate, again, is connected to the moon and predates the Greeks. And so that connection to the moon that eventually Artemis embodies can be traced from there. And if we're talking about Artemis's at Ephesus, I've
Hmm.
been reading a bit more as I'm working on this book now, Artemis in Ephesus. And I can't remember the scholar's name, but one of the scholars says that perhaps her name, Artemis, comes from Ephesus or Ephesian roots because it's not Greek, right?
Right, okay. So
And
sorry, it's not an originally, so we got a similar thing to Aphrodite, which I know Aphrodite's
that's
name,
right.
her name has been argued as being non-Greek.
That's
Oh, so
right.
that's the same with Artemis.
That's right. That's right. Yes. And so someone was arguing that this may have been actually the original. So Ephesus and pre-Ephesus area, which is sort of modern day Turkey, may have had the original version, if we can say, of Artemis, which then complicates matters because the Artemis at Ephesus is a very different divinity and
Yeah.
embodied differently. So I think one of the mysteries of Artemis for me and one of the fascinations is trying to trace her back and seeing her in everything. Um, and so I think that I would lean if you put me in a corner and ask me, I would lean towards the mistress of animals as
Mm,
sort of the divinity that she embodies best and that remains like part
mm,
of her attributes throughout the Greek world. But then when they turn her into a virginal maiden who frolics in the woods and basically doesn't do much, then I become a little bit more where I'm like, I don't know. she loses a lot
Yeah.
of her depth that way.
I think it's on the Francois vase where she's holding, sometimes it's a stag and a lion, or it's two
Yes,
animals. And it's
yes,
just it's one of those images that once you see it a lot more. It's just a beautiful image. I think possibly one of the words to associate with her from the classical period onwards is frolic.
yes,
That's what she does, pretty
yes,
much. Whereas
yes,
prior to that, you have something very different. You've got a goddess holding very dangerous wild animals.
yes.
You've mentioned one place which we'll probably start with, and that's Ephesus, which I've been lucky
Hmm.
enough to visit. It's a fascinating site if you ever get to go there. But yeah, so let's start then with Ephesus, because one of the questions that I've had back, in fact, I've had some great feedback. So thank you if you've asked questions and you want to know more about this. And this is where I've been able to incorporate what you want into how the episode is being laid out. The cults and locations of Artemis are very, very interesting because they're very unique, they're very different, and they speak to different aspects of her. And perhaps then start with Ephesus, because Ephesus is probably her most famous location. I mean, there was that big temple there for a start.
Yes, I think that Ephesus, and this is why I left Ephesus for a second book, because there is so much to say. So I have it half written, and now I'm finding some new connections. And so I hope to have it out by next spring. When I went to Ephesus, there's only one sort of column left there,
Mm,
of the temple of old. I would say that in Ephesus is where we see Artemis in her full power, and now, perhaps according to some, in her original full power. And
mm.
what's fascinating there is that not only is she also the mistress of animals, so that continues, the mistress of the wild, that is there, but she's also a mother figure,
Okay.
you know? And that really, so, in the Greek Artemis, we have her as the goddess of childbirth because she supposedly came out first and helped Leto deliver Apollo. I think that's just a simplistic Greek explanation
Mm.
for the power that she had as a mother figure. And in Ephesus, we see her more as sort of the godmother, the queen bee, right? So she feeds and nourishes and takes care of all of her worshipers or
Mm.
community. I can't put into words how powerful and how unique actually her statue is.
You're referring to the statue, which I think is one of those statues that people are always discussing. It's the one where you have really just a head, because the body itself
Yes.
is very difficult in a way to describe. I'll put an image of it on the episode notes. Hands are up, as I seem to remember,
Hmm.
and then you've got on her upper sort of torso, you've got these globes, and
Hmm.
there's been various uh, arguments, debates about what they are. For some people, they've said, oh, they were bull's testicles because that
Yes.
represented fertility, and I think the other one is their breast because again, this is about her motherhood. The one that I read, and if I can find the paper, I'll link it again into the episode notes, was someone who said this all came about because at some point early on in her worship, there was a votive figure, and the votive figure would have been wooden. And this is another thing that people always think about when perhaps Assassin's Odyssey actually did this quite well. Its statues were occasionally marble and were occasionally stone, but very often votive figures were wooden. Lots of
Yes.
votive figures were wooden, and they didn't look a great deal like the deity, but they weren't meant to. They were meant to represent it in some way. And when
Yes.
you had her worship sort of taking over or developing from the previous Kybele or Cybele, apologies, I never know how to pronounce it,
Hmm.
that attracted some bees. And there was a bee nest, a wild bee nest that attached itself to the votive figure, and that was seen as a blessing or as seen as divine approval, which we actually find elsewhere in ancient Greece. It's quite common. Zeus was fed by wild bees. There's lots of links between bees and approval as sort of a
That's right.
divine
Hmm.
sign. And they said, no, this is actually wild bee larva. This is actually the nest that you would have attached to the original votive figure, and that got developed and obviously possibly lost. So people then reappropriated and said, no, perhaps they could be something else. These globes make more sense if they are balls, testicles, breasts, whatever. And it's even within the statue, there's a story of what was there before and what's there now. Because we start with, I don't know if you can say much about Kybele and what she was and how Artemis evolved from her or had an origin in her on the site. Because I think
Hmm.
that's the big question that I find at
Hmm.
Ephesus.
Hmm. So okay. So two things. So first, I absolutely 100% subscribe to the bee theory. I have a colleague that subscribes to the bull theory. So the bull theory comes from one of the rituals where they would castrate a bull and throw the testicles on the statue for fertility rites.
Ah, okay.
Um, yeah, and so that's why people think, oh, these must be bull testicles. I disagree because that only happened in a couple of places, so it wasn't a very popular custom. And the breast theory is a later, how do I say this nicely, patriarchal, Christian sort of obsession with this combination of Kybele and Artemis. And so we don't, in the ancient statues that we found, none of them have actual like nipples. You know what
Okay.
I mean?
Yeah.
So later on, like as Europeans started painting her and drawing her and even putting her in as a fountain, like for example, all over Italy, you might find in the Tivoli garden, there's a statue of her, a fountain of her, and she's got the bulbous sort of jacket on, but then there's like nipples and water comes out. But
Oh,
again, that's 17th century
yeah.
imagination. So the breast thing is a much later interpretation. And so the bees to me make the most sense. And also because she's got bees up and down the sides of
Mm,
the statue itself. She's got
mm.
other animals on there, but she's got that. And of course, because her priests were called Melisai
Yep.
or Melissi. And so there's a lot of bee iconography around her. And so for me, that makes the most sense. And
Yeah.
now, sorry, I forgot what your other part, the other,
No,
the
no, I
other
was just
part
gonna
of your
say
question.
about I join you on Team B. In fact, the first ever podcast
Yes, Team
episode
B.
yeah,
Yes,
the first ever podcast I ever did was on bees in antiquity, and
I'm
this is where
fascinated by bees.
I covered it briefly on that. I wanna find it again, I can't find the image, but apparently Ephesian hoplites so hoplites would have various representations of their city-state where
Hmm.
they were from on their shield, and apparently for Ephesus it was a bee,
Yes, and their coins. On one side was Artemis, on the
right?
other side was a bee.
So
Like
there's
there's a
this
lot of
whole
information.
real bee theme
Yes,
running all the way through Ephesus. So it doesn't
absolutely.
make because I think otherwise you turn to people and you say you try and make the argument. You say, "Oh no, there was actually wild bee nests," and they look back at you and you go, "No, no, hang on a sec. There's a whole bee thing that goes on in Ephesus anyway. So this is
Yes,
not sort of just on its own. This stands within a wider context of
yes,
bee culture within Ephesus."
yes. And also the ancients were fascinated with bees. They saw the queen bee as virginal, right? And so they
Oh,
had this obsession, because and so they at first they thought that, bees reproduce virginally in a sense. And then there's also an older mythology in which they believe that like life comes out of bees,
yeah.
right? So
Well,
so
honey was
there's
something they saw as being it never
that's right.
rotted, it didn't break down to anything. It was yeah, it was used for a lot of different things. They saw honey as
Yes.
almost a not a miraculous thing, but something that had a quality to it that you just
I would
couldn't see
say,
mystical.
yeah, I would say almost miraculous. I don't know if you've ever read, but at Delphi, they used to use fermented honey. They used to make it into a kind of incense.
Oh,
And there's a story, Rigoglioso, the author, writes about it. There's a story that the actual prophetess or oracle at Delphi would stand on top of this sort of fermented honey concoction. And as it would smoke, it would go up into her body through
yeah,
her
yeah,
personal, oh yeah, and that would inspire or whatever a prophecy.
right.
So they always saw bees as prophetic because they thought that they could predict storms and
Yep.
that they could predict. So bees are actually much more fascinating in the ancient world than I think we've ever really given them credit for. I think there's more information coming out now as
Mm,
bee experts start to talk about it more.
mm.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating. And Artemis was 100% associated at Ephesus was 100% associated with bees. And so to me, the most logical thing is that this jacket that she wears or whatever it
Yeah.
is full of beehives.
So
It makes sense.
I don't wanna anticipate or give any spoilers away for your upcoming book then, but how do you find the relationship change? Because obviously you had an entity there which was Kybele, and now you have Artemis.
Mm.
What was if you could summarize, if you can, the shift, what changed and yeah, what was the dynamics
That's
there?
a That's a very good question. So definitely Kybele is many-breasted. So
Okay.
that is a change. That is no, that is a difference. And because Kybele is definitely again a mother goddess, but with wild attributes because she has
Right.
these two lions as
Yeah.
well. I would argue, and people can agree or disagree, that Kybele is not so much a mistress of animals. That her essence leans more towards nurturing, fertility, earthing, that kind of stuff. And so I think what happens with Artemis of Ephesus is that she takes up a few of those attributes, but has significant wild animals.
Mm.
Why, like, there's a significant wildness to her that I'm not sure that Kybele has.
Right.
And so Artemis, to me, Artemis is, I have a friend who's also very obsessed with Kybele, but to me, Artemis is a bit more wild, is a bit more unpredictable,
Mm.
is less mothery per se, like less like your mom, but more like your bestie.
Mm.
And so I find that, I find that a little more. So I think that's what makes Artemis unique in that way. But there are attributes there for sure, because the Greeks, like, and even the ancients in the Mediterranean, they didn't really care. They didn't think the way we think about separating divinities, like
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
one, they could share attributes and they
Yeah.
borrowed and they reinvent, right? So and so for us now to take that apart and be like, oh, this is specific to this god, that becomes quite difficult.
Yeah.
We've been sold sort of the pantheon as this is a god of war, this is a god of lightning, this is a god of hunt. And then when you dig deep, I guess that's simplifying it for kids.
Yeah.
But when you dig deeper, you realize that actually the ancients took pride in changing that god for
Mm.
them, because they had to say, let's say for Artemis, wherever, let's say we're going to talk about Sparta or Ravona, they would say, well, Artemis came here and she did this for us.
Yeah.
Therefore, she is unique to us here.
Yeah.
So they took pride in that, right? It wasn't like we must have the same God everywhere. And then
No.
another village would say, no, no, she came over here. And
Yeah.
then there's this legend about her. So and that happens for all the gods, not
Well,
just
you
for
see,
Artemis.
just read Pausanias, and
That's
Pausanias is
right.
just, oh, this river here, this is where Artemis borrowed a Ford Fiesta, went out for a weekend, had a great time, did
That's
bother,
right.
came
That's right.
back, petrol tank was empty, but we didn't ask questions. And then someone else will say, no, 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 no. In our village, 5 kilometers to the south,
That's right.
she got on a bike. It was actually a tandem with Apollo, and they just had a really good time because they were again driving. Artemis can drive. You
That's
have
it.
these variations, and in between it all, you have a local hero who was involved. Somehow, he was the mechanic because the car broke down, and that's
That's
why they
right.
worship this tree. It's brilliant. You just find Pausanias, just pick 5 pages and read through it, and you get the idea for all. Everything had an association. There were
Yes.
associations with rivers, with trees, with groves, with everything. It's really quite
Yes.
nice. It's
Yes.
quite touching.
Pausanias is living my dream life. Can I just tell you that while I was doing my PhD, I always envisioned myself like redoing a Pausanias travel,
Mm.
What an endeavor that would be. Take a couple of years and just go around
Well, I've just
doing.
got into. I'm late to the party as ever. I got into cruising with Jane McDonald, and
Mm.
she's kind of doing that sort of thing that I would like to do. Although I'm not sure I'd be very good on a ship or a boat, of just going around the place and finding various things to do. So there we
Yes,
go. Jane McDonald of
yes,
Pausanias, a link that you
yes.
won't ever hear in any other podcast again.
That's right.
So
That's right.
we've looked at Ephesus. I think there's a lot there, and hopefully,
Hmm.
perhaps when your book's out, I can get you on and we can do an entire episode,
Absolutely,
or
yes.
you will do an entire episode because obviously you have your podcast. I think people would be really interested in that.
Yes.
Going to go across now, I think, and talk about Broran, because Broran's one of the places where she's got a strong association, and it also involves the bear, which a lot of people were very interested by. We got a lot of questions about her association with the
Hmm.
bear. How does it work? Could you talk about what the cult was at Broron, what the function of it was, what the rituals, and again what the association with the bear was? I appreciate that's a fair few things to go over there.
Yes. Okay. Ooh, that's one of my favorite places. I don't know if you've ever been to Verona, Greece, but it's just beautiful. It's actually a beach town,
Ah,
tourist town. So when I went to, so it originally the water or the sea came right up to the temple. But now I would say the sea is a good 20, 30 kilometers away, if not more. And
That's
so
just
now the
like
temple,
Ephesus. Sorry, but that's just
yes,
when you go
that's
to
right.
Ephesus and I thought the first time I went there, I thought they were, "Nah, you're having me on there." No. But it was the same at
Yes,
Pompeii when I went to Pompeii. Like, these
yes,
rings here, because it was a harbour. Well,
yes,
no, it wasn't. But people forget coastlines really change. When they looked at
that's right.
Troy, they would try to work out the coastline of Troy, and they worked out that the geography of it was far different at the mythological date of Troy in the 13th century, 12th century. And it would have panned out completely different in terms of where the Greeks would have been and Troy probably was. Anyway, sorry, carry on. I was just
No, it's no, you're absolutely right. And that's exactly what happened to us. So we got to Verona, and here I am getting off a bus going, wow, this is a lovely beach town and restaurants and everything, And but where is this temple? And then I'm asking people, because the temple itself, it was the original dig was by John Papa Dimitriou, and but he died, halfway through the dig, and so the dig stopped, and I wanted to see what had they collected, had they, what had they done there since his passing, and they did a wonderful job, by the way. But you couldn't find it in Verona, and so then I was asking people, where is this temple? And they're like, oh, just keep walking. It's a couple of kilometers away. So I was like, okay, a couple of kilometers in the middle of summer in Greece. That's a lot of fun. And then we get to this place, kind of like a fruit stand, a couple of kilometers later. We're like, oh, we're looking for the temple of Verona. Where is it? They're like, oh, yeah, keep going. A couple of kilometers. Needless to say, about 10 kilometers later, we arrive at a site that is completely deserted and, of course, obviously dry.
mm,
And we see a sign for the temple, and then we get to the actual temple site where the ruins are. And there's just a few ruins. Anybody can Google it and find. There's just a few ruins left. And so I took a bunch of pictures there and all that kind of stuff. And then I asked there's an attendant there who actually saw my mother and I. My mother was with me and saw us, and we had walked for so long. She's like, "You want some water?" And they gave us some water. It was very sweet.
oh,
And then I said, I know there's a museum here somewhere for everything that they found. She looks and she goes, yeah, it's just a couple of more kilometers that way. And it was.
they
So
make
I
you
went
work
in
for
and
it.
they really did. They really did. I went in and no one was there. It was empty, which is my favorite thing.
Yeah,
And
that's what.
so,
Sorry, that's wonderful when you go somewhere
isn't it?
and you're
Isn't
you're in
it?
the museum or somewhere on your own. I know it's going to sound
Absolutely.
horrible, very selfish, but you just, yeah, you have that moment when you're in a museum or somewhere like that, or even a site, you're completely on your
Yes.
own. Anyway, sorry.
So I went in, and this is where I found, and where they found, and they had to put them in the museum, all of these figurines. So there were animal figurines, people figurines,
Oh, okay.
especially children figurines. So, and then I was like, okay, this was really, really fascinating. So, what the ritual that happened in this temple was what we call sort of the Temple of the Bears. And in short, it was a place where young women would come to leave behind their wildness of their childhood and be initiated into womanhood.
Ah,
And some of the ways that they did that, so that's a major sort of festival or rituals that happen there. And they would be dressed in these saffron dresses, and they would walk around, dance around, depends on what you read, and make offerings to the goddess. What they would offer is interesting. They would offer things like their childhood toys, their childhood clothes.
oh, okay.
Yeah, or they would offer little statuettes of things that they loved. And so Artemis here is in charge of the initiation of young women. Now, there is a discussion um, that this is also the place in which Artemis may have initiated young men as
Mm,
well. Again, same thing, from childhood into manhood. So it was a very a stronghold for this initiation.
mm.
The other thing that happened here, so lots of things happen here, is that if a mother had a child, or if a child was sick or anything like that, they would create statues of the child if they had money, or if they didn't have money, they would offer something else, and they would leave it in the temple so that Artemis would protect that child
Oh, okay.
for life. And so this is why we
Wow.
have so many
Right, that
little
make
kids
yeah. Oh, so
statues.
those statues weren't,
Yes,
they were based on real people.
that's right.
That's
That's right.
wow.
And so there was a whole industry of ceramic workers,
Mm,
where depending on how much you could afford. So if you couldn't afford much, you just got like a standard kid, let's say.
yeah.
But if you could afford more, they would shape this child into your child, so it
Oh.
would look like your child. And so there is that I would say that's one of the largest collections of what people would offer to Artemis. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating. I think I took pictures of literally
W
the entire
Were these all
museum.
in the museum there?
Yes,
And
everything
you
that survived.
and you're in the museum on your own. Knowing that,
Yes,
I would be spooked
yes.
out. That would spook me out. No, no, I was looking at something that was based on a child from that many, obviously from that period. Just that
Yeah.
link right there, I would be drawn to it. I'd wanna be in there, don't get me wrong, but I'd have hairs on the back of my neck going up because I don't know, perhaps I've watched too many horror films, but one of those statues just winks or, hang on a sec, the head moved.
Oh my gosh.
It's
Yes.
just that sort of,
No.
but this is what I find beautiful about ancient history. We have these big dominant columns, you've got the big temples, you've got everything else. But the
Mhm.
things that make it real are the poignancy of a intimate object, something you can say that was based on someone. Someone held
Mhm.
someone held that. And okay, it might have been the really, really cheap version, it might have been the expensive version, but someone sat and fashioned that based on a
Mhm.
human that existed. And now you're looking
Yes.
at it.
Yes. You think that's spooky. This is
Uh-oh.
also where they performed human sacrifices, right?
Ah,
So
okay.
this is where the Taurian Artemis was originally brought, which is sort of what
Yeah.
makes Bravone so interesting. And there's sort of an orgiastic, mystical ritual around her, and we're told that there was initially human
Mm,
sacrifice, and that people would that the people in this area would actually throw others, like foreigners or
mm.
strangers, people outside the village, off the cliffs
Yeah,
in sacrifice to the Taurian Artemis. And it is associated with bears. And so that, for example, the young women were considered bears. And I don't think that people think about bears when they think about Greece, but there were actually
yeah,
populations of
yeah.
bears in Greece back in the day. When I did my research on bears in Greece, they still have conservation sites where there are bears in some of the northern forests, like north, like in the
Do we know what
Thessaloniki
type of
area.
bears? Sorry, do we know
They're
what type of
brown bears.
brown
They're
bears?
brown
Okay,
bears.
cool.
Yeah, they're brown bears. So, but we're told that historically they might have come even lower. So now they're
Mm,
like sort of the Thessaloniki area, north of Thessaloniki in those
yeah,
forests. But we are, at least we think that they came or they were around in much more of the southern areas, just as the deer were, right? Like when
yeah,
you don't see deer now in Greece very much. Again, you have to go north. Um, and so and I know that someone had asked something about bears and they were asking like
yeah,
what's the bear connection?
yeah,
And the bear has always been, even in like northern European, Eastern European, and other sort of early pre-Roman tribal cultures, bear has always been this, especially the she bear has always been this mystical figure of both protection,
mm,
mothering, power. There are stories of bears, like of people welcoming bears into their homes, especially when they're pregnant,
wow.
or touching bears, because I guess mother bears are so protective of their cubs,
Yeah, yeah,
and yet so powerful and fearsome.
mm,
And so bears have, and actually I just posted a video today on my Instagram of this bear cave that I found in Crete for Artemis. And you have to go like, it's quite a hike down, and you have to like figure out it's inside this massive cave. But there's a natural limestone build that
mm.
looks like a white bear that is
Ah,
climbing into a pool of water. Like that's sort of miraculous. Like if you're in the ancient world and you walk into this cave and there's this limestone figure,
yeah.
that's miraculous, right? I mean,
You're
they
you're
didn't
gonna
see white
rationalize that
bears,
through myth, or you're gonna
right?
rationalize it through some
Yes,
divine
that's right.
association.
That's right.
Absolutely.
And when I walked in myself, I thought, oh my, like this is so random. And the cave is
Mm,
dark, everything is black. And you have this in the middle of the cave, you have this, what looks even today as a white bear climbing into a pool of water. And there, the same kind of ritual was done, but the girls would go up the stairs beside the bear and go into the pool and come out on the other side. And that was sort of an initiation rite. But again, another cave bear, or bear imagery to Artemis. So bears were her symbol for a long time. And as a side note, I got to tell you, before I started being more like talking about Artemis in my life, just like a few months ago, because then up until then I was doing more academic stuff. Well, here's Artemis, here's A, B, and C. I had this dream, Neil, and I don't remember my dreams. I'm one of those people that never remembers them. But I had these dreams where bears were breaking into my house, and I was walking from room to room trying to kind of get away from them. They weren't trying to hurt me, but they would just turn the door and come after me. And I would go into another room and they would turn the door and come after me. And I woke up like just remembering this vivid dream. And the first thing that came to mind is like, Artemis is coming for me. She's like, yo, like you need to go out there and like talk about my stuff and get my stuff, you know? It was the first kind of dream that I had where I was like, oh my God, like now she's just really saying, you know, get my stuff out there. Anyway, that's a side kind of rant on,
No,
but it's
that
just I never had a dream about bears in that way. Like, you know, it was
I'm gonna
weird.
probably have a few nightmares about those child statues or star child statuettes. That'll be so thanks for that. I'm gonna hit the coffee straight after this and no sleep for the next few days. While you were talking about bears and you were saying that they were far more prevalent than people think of now, I think I saw something recently on social media and someone was asking about lions. And again, people didn't realize that there were lions in ancient Greece. In fact, Herodotus made a comment about them when you had the Persian invasion, and
Hmm.
they were actually predating on lots of the camels. They found the camels easy
Hmm.
pickings on the Persian baggage trains. So the
Hmm.
idea again that we have the sort of different type of animals than we currently would expect to see in that part of the world. And there's
Yeah.
something else you mentioned. It was about sacrifice. Now, I did an entire episode on human sacrifice. There are instances where we find Artemis in and around human sacrifice.
Yes.
Possibly the most famous instance is with the Trojan War, where you have Iphigenia being sacrificed. In some myths, as Iphigenia was about to be killed, Artemis appears and
Yes.
replaces her with, actually snatches her away and replaces her with a deer.
Yes.
And she takes her away. And you have Euripides' Iphigenia at Tauris, which actually explains that she's then taken all the way to the Taurus, which is, if you're not aware, the modern Crimea.
Hmm.
And that's apparently where her worship was thought to have been at. And there is this element of sacrifice, human sacrifice. So you mentioning that, and there's another bloody example. Using that's not me swearing. That's the correct term that we'll come to in a moment to do with
Hmm.
Artemis.
Hmm.
Which again, when you talk about that family member who's just that bit different from everyone else, she's got that in her game somewhere. Just
Hmm.
that relevance to human sacrifice. I was going to say briefly mention Taurus or Taurian. You said it,
Hmm.
or Taurian Artemis. Now this is to do with, as I said, the Crimea. Is there much on her that we know about?
So we know that there was human sacrifice for her, and
Mm,
we know that she arrives at Ravon or Baran, and we know that then she is then that sort of she becomes the Braranian Artemis there, and then that representation ends up in Sparta. So it's a
yeah,
bit of sort of it's not a reincarnation, but it's a connection between
yeah,
all of them, right? So she arrives in one place, she's worshipped there, she moves to another place, she's worshipped there. And we know that all of the rituals that took place for this particular, let's say, readaptation were bloody, or
yeah,
many of them were bloody. Like there were bloody rituals
yeah.
for all of them. And in fact, I can think of at least three places where there were human sacrifices, right off the top of my head. So there are a lot of stories of human sacrifice for Artemis.
Mm.
And I'm not an expert in other gods quite the way that I am with her. And I know that there are other gods that also had human sacrifices, but for her, I don't think that people expect it, you
No,
know?
because again, how would you if the word that we associate her, which we've decided is going to be associated with her, is frolicking? You don't expect a character with that representation to have that
Mm-hmm.
kind of backstory. And I'm glad you mentioned Sparta because I would say if you went to people and said, okay, Sparta, you got the six packs, you've got a load of stuff that never happened, but people think it did.
Mm-hmm.
Name a really important deity. Name your top or one of the top deities for Sparta. People are going to be going, whoever the god of six packs was, Ares. They don't realize Artemis was pretty much one of
Yes.
the crucial deities worshipped
Yes.
at Sparta. We don't realize that she was really fundamental to Sparta.
Yes.
So perhaps we can talk about Sparta in particular, linking in with Orthia, which was
Hmm.
a particular my favorite festival involving punishment and cheese. Yeah, see if we could just talk about how she was found at Sparta and Orthia.
Yes. Okay. So Sparta. So when people think about Sparta, even when I thought about Sparta for a long time, I thought about Athena, right? Because you're like, oh, the Spartans like to fight and da da da.
Yeah.
And imagine my surprise as a young person doing research when I found that, in fact, the Spartans worshipped Artemis before battle. Before each battle, they worshipped Artemis. So then I fell down this kind
Mm,
of rabbit hole going, what? What are you talking about? Why? Same kind of situation, right? How does that work? And Artemis Orthia is sort of the goddess that stands erect, right? Because her statue was said to literally just have been a pole.
yeah.
Again, another fascinating aspect, because when you want to look up Artemis Orthia, there's a couple of small, tiny little woodcuts of her
Mm,
there, but there really isn't a really big accumulation of images of Artemis at Sparta. And so you don't know what she kind of looks like. And the little woodcuts that we do have in the museum in Athens are basically just almost like a pole wood cutting with a head kind of thing,
yeah.
right? And that's all that she is. And so people are like, that's interesting because it's not like the huntress
No.
frolicking virgin that we're talking about.
It looks a bit I think I've seen one of those, and it looks a bit like those sort of Scandinavian chess pieces that you
Yes,
might have seen.
exactly.
It
Yes.
it doesn't look if you were shown this and said you probably wouldn't even think it belonged to Greek mythology or
Hmm.
Greek sculpture, but it is.
Hmm.
Not everything in ancient Greece was nice chiseled marble or stone. It could be representation through a type of votive figure that we don't always see and would have been more perishable because it was wooden. It wasn't a nice, lovely
Yes,
statue that the
that's
Romans
right.
would copy or the Greeks would have in a temple. It could just be a wooden votive figure that obviously is going to degrade, is not going to last.
That's right. And I also think there's this misconception about pagans, particularly around the idea that pagans worship the statue as like the god itself, which is it's a complex way of thinking of it. But
Mm,
yes, they do and they don't kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like,
mm,
obviously, this is a representation of the god, but not literally a god, right?
yeah,
And so sometimes I think we get confused when we think about, well, what would a wooden statue that's just a pole mean to them? Well, it meant everything because that
yeah.
was the way that they honored. And so her ritual there starts out of it starts out of a battle that took place in the area, like lots of tribal war that was happening in there. And there was a lot of sort of violence and death. And after the slaughter, like after the violence and death that it initially was happening in the area, an oracle said, you know what, if we soak this idol, let's say of Artemis, in blood, she may help us either win the battle or create a moment of peace, whatever. So then they began doing this by killing one person. So they would kill one person and then they would soak the wooden idol with blood. Of course, then that was starting to look, it was frowned upon over time. So what they did is they did this fascinating ritual where they'd have all these young boys in almost like a coliseum kind of amphitheater area, and they would walk around the statue, these young boys, and they would whip themselves, okay, bloody. And the last one standing would be the most honorable. So they would all start passing out because they would bleed so much. And the last one standing would be sort of the most honorable, and their family would gain all of this honor. And the priestess of Artemis at Sparta would hold the idol. So the idol is not massive. I don't know what, people say different things about it, but enough that a woman would be able to hold it out, right?
Yeah.
So she's holding it out in front of her while these boys walk around her and the idol, whipping themselves. And she would, like, as she was getting tired holding it, obviously she would sort of entice them to go faster, 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 faster. So you can imagine all these men whipping themselves into a frenzy.
Mm,
Slowly they would start passing out. Of course, the first one to pass out, their family sort of loses face. And the priestess and the idol would be covered in blood, and then there would be one last man standing, and that was sort of the winner. And they did this every year,
mm,
every year. So I would say in this case she's a super bloody
yeah.
goddess. But also the weird thing for me is, like, the way that you almost beat your young men in senseless before the war or in preparation for a war. It's kind of a
Mm.
weird, well, the boys were about 14, but still for Spartans, that was a grown man.
Yeah.
So so she has this sort of bloody history that I don't think we read about.
I should just add that the link with cheese is that this was adapted later, I believe. I think it's Xenophon who mentions it, and it's certainly mentioned by Pausanias, where these young Spartans were trying to get to a platform where they had lots of cheese. And you'd have people on the platform with whips.
Hmm.
And the person who could get the most cheese and endure the most pain was seen as the most honourable. So we've looked at the Spartan Artemis. We're going to go outside of Greece because there was a question about this, and I think this is was a very good question about Artemis in southern Italy and in particular Sicily. So
Hmm.
what have we
Hmm.
got for her in Sicily? I think it's Syracuse, which is
Yes, Syracuse.
most strongly associated with it.
Yes, 100%. I think so. She was worshipped at Syracuse and parts of Sicily as Agraterra and Sotera. So, and there's actually a little image, a little statuette that it was found there about 400 BCE, where she's just kind of riding a deer, and it was found in Syracuse. It's in Italy now, and I would argue that she would worship there more as Agraterra or Mistress of Animals or Mistress of the Wild,
Okay.
um, because I think that's the aspect that we see on some coins of her, and I think that's the aspect that the Romans, particularly here, or the Syracusans, let's say more correctly, really enjoyed. So they really enjoyed her aspect as a mistress of wilderness and that sort of wildness. There was still a little bit of the childbirth protectress of it. She was still seen as a virginal maiden there as well.
Mm.
But she was very strongly venerated for her control, excuse me, of the wild and untamed places.
Okay.
As Soteria, she is, and Soteria is sort of a savior, which is another fascinating aspect for me of Artemis. There, she, in that kind of, let's say, incarnation or association, she's associated with Apollo.
Mm.
And again, sort of sometimes she's associated with Leto, of course, as their parents. But I think that that sort of mistress of the wild and mistress of the animals, or like that Potniatheron kind of
Mm.
incarnation, is what she was mostly attested to in Syracuse. And so far, what we found a little bit, mostly coins, and like I said, a statuette. So I think she's similar to what we've been talking about. The
Mm.
Romans really enjoyed her stories of blood sacrifice,
Mm.
although we don't have any evidence that there was human sacrifice to her there, like in
Mm.
Syracuse. And we are told actually that her temple, what am I saying? We are told. I don't know who tells us. Anyway, classicists believe, I'm like, so we're told. Classicists believe that her temple there, the temple to Artemis Agraterra there, is the first building to be built on in Sicily.
Wow, really?
Yeah, like the first temple building. Sorry, my
Ah,
apologies.
okay.
Not
No, no,
like
no. Yeah,
housing,
yeah.
but the first
Okay.
temple building or like worship building. There are people that say that the people that came to well, lots of people say that people that came to Sicily came from Malta.
Mm.
So there were whoever inhabited and whoever built those stone temples in Malta that are sort of Neolithic,
Mm.
that the generations of those individuals then went to Sicily. So there are some arguments that, oh, they may have built other things before this temple to Artemis that we haven't found yet. So there is that argument.
Mm.
But most classics agree that the sort of first temple to a divinity that was ever built in Sicily was to Artemis Agraterra.
Oh,
It's pretty cool.
I found out just doing some reading, and I
Hmm.
found an interesting reference to a sanctuary of Artemis as being near
Hmm.
Rhegium in southern Italy. So we're talking about Magna Graecia here. That's referenced in Thucydides, where he's talking about the Sicilian expedition. The Athenians stayed over, and they couldn't find anywhere to stay basically, and they camped near
Mm.
the sanctuary of Artemis. So there was evidence of her. And I did some reading, try to do some research. There's lots of inferred or implied
Yes.
worship of her. There's nothing substantial. I mean, I think that if you're going to look for Artemis in southern Italy and Sicily, you're looking at Syracuse. Whereas
Yes.
in southern Italy, there is still elements of her. They've found terracottas, I think it's Heraclea. It shouldn't be that much of a surprise because if you go further north, you've got the Etruscans. And the
Yes.
Etruscans had their version of Artemis.
Yes.
It's called Artemi or Artemis. And she was, again, she had a similar function in that she was associated strongly with animals, particularly wolves, apparently, which,
Hmm.
if you're looking at Rome, is very, very apt.
Yes, right. A part of my research trip was going to be in Sicily and Syracuse to kind of see what's around there.
Mm,
I went to Malta and then to Crete and whatever a couple of summers ago, but then the pandemic movement like made movement around very
yeah.
complicated, and Italy was shut down for a while. So I didn't get to go to Sicily or Syracuse there, but I would love to go there next and kind of see things for myself. And local legends are always
Yeah.
the most amazing ways to learn things about the
Yeah.
past there. So that would be really fascinating. I don't know. I was really glad that someone asked questions about Sicily and southern Italy,
Mm.
so that people are aware of that.
And it's no judgment on anyone, but you think of
Hmm.
ancient Greece and
Hmm.
you overlay that with modern Greece as a
Yes.
geographical concept. You don't think of Sicily, you don't think of the Black Sea, you don't think of North Africa at Cyrene, for
Yes.
example, these sorts of
Hmm.
places. So we've looked at the cults, or we've covered some of those cults, which again all fascinating. I think you could probably do an episode in each, to be totally honest with you.
Yes.
One of the central tenets of her and associations that she's very strong with are the different stages of womanhood, as is probably best exemplified in Braun. You've got the change from girl to woman. But there's also, like you said, you have mentioned about the motherhood, childbirth, all of this. And yet, alongside this, she's a deity whose virginity is very, very important or is given great weight. how how does that work? How is the interaction between those different concepts not necessarily contradictions? Because some people could see them as contradictions, but there's obviously associations there that work. How do they
Yes.
work?
So, okay. That was one of my questions too, because when I was looking into the Virgin Mary, and I kept finding associations between the Virgin Mary and Artemis, both at Ephesus and some of the Greek Artemis, I thought to myself, how is that possible? She's never had a child. So, how can Artemis be both virgin and mother? And there's a couple of ways that that can happen. The very first one, I think, the most basic one, is the concept of parthenogenesis in Greek myth, which is the idea that, for example, a goddess can give birth on her own, like Hera gives birth to Hephaestus, for example, or like Gaia gives birth to Uranus, her consort, before they begin birthing other
Mm,
things. And so, this concept that a divinity can have spontaneously birthed children was something that might have been or was common to the Greeks. However, that being said, Artemis literally does not have a child. And so,
mm,
again, that comes up okay. So the second part of that is her virginity. And I think we both know that virginity in ancient Greece was not associated with a hymen or like physical virginity, but rather virginity is a word for independence, that is non married, not married,
mm,
never married kind of
mm.
thing. And so Athena is seen as a virgin, and Artemis are seen as a virgin. And so I don't think that the term virginity necessarily applies to her ability to be mother. So then we get into the sort of, again, reincarnations or associations with previous goddesses. And so, for example, in Crete, she is often associated with Elethea. So Elethea was a goddess of childbirth and a goddess of protector, so childbirth. Then we have the story that the Greeks give us, that she literally is born before Apollo and helps birth Apollo.
Mm.
And so there again, we have this association with not herself having a child, but being the primary person at childbirth,
Yeah.
right? And so then it makes sense that I guess it kind of makes, because there's no one else there. I'm trying to think. There's no one else there that the Greeks pray to for the actual inception, right? What they're praying for is simply fertility, let me have children. And then once they become pregnant, they go, let me carry this child to term safely, let me birth this child safely.
Mm,
That's where Artemis comes in. She comes in the part where it's like, let me carry the child to term, let
mm,
me birth the child to term. And so those then are because she helped a god being birthed. And there's lots of other village stories in which she helps mothers in birthing, or the children are born successfully because Artemis was there. And so that association becomes so powerful that she doesn't need to have children
Right.
to be the protectress of childbirth. And
Oh, I see. So really, the weight that she has within that context is because she's fulfilling a function,
yes,
rather than I need to evidence my worth in this particular scenario by having lots of kids. I don't
yes,
need to evidence on the back of that. I evidence on the back of the fact that I'm the person who will help you have a healthy child and
that's right.
yourself remain healthy during that process. I see. Okay.
Yes, yes. And so it's very fascinating how the Greeks thought about this because so for example in many feminist cultures we have this almost like not a resentment but a push against women being identified as, just mothers or just reproducers. And it's fascinating to me that in the ancient world, Artemis, who is not a mother herself, doesn't birth a child herself, does have authority over this. And the Greeks see no problem with that. I think for us, we see a problem where, like, well, if you should be a mother if you are an authority over children. But for the Greeks, absolutely not. That's not necessary. The fact that she's a protectress of childbirth, but then also the one that initiates children into adulthood, so she's almost like the sort of magna mater of
Mm,
children,
mm.
right? Everything and that goes, like I said, even for child animals, let's say, or whatever, puppies or cubs or whatever. So she has this umbrella authority over any youth that is not come to maturity. And that's from
Right.
childbirth to that. And the Greeks didn't have a problem with that. Like for them, it didn't, like she doesn't have to be a wolf to take care of cubs or
No,
protect
fair
them,
enough. Yeah.
right? Yeah, and I think when we say the word virgin, like I said, we automatically make her into a 15-year-old. And so
Mm.
then in our minds it's like, how is she in charge of childbirth?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
she's a serious divinity. She is a grown, fully aggressive, fully matured divinity.
And again, something that your book really, really works on to explore is she's someone who has got very much what we would consider a dark side.
Hmm.
It's
Yes,
she has this part to her which is excised quite cleanly from more modern understandings and retellings of her as a kind of Phoebe from
yes,
Friends, happy clappy, let's go have a
yes,
picnic. I'll
yes,
put my hand up and a bird will land on it and we'll all be friends.
yes,
They
yes.
forget the other side to her.
Yes. And the interesting thing is, as a mother myself and as, women, when we think about a goddess that we would want to be protected by, it is a goddess that has a very strict, a very aggressive dark side. Like that's who you
Mm.
want as your
Yeah,
protectress.
yeah.
Certainly you don't want the maiden and frolicking in the woods. I mean, she's nice, it's cute, but and so
Yeah.
it she's cute, she's wonderful, but
I want a bear, not a butterfly,
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Like if you're in the woods and you want to meet Artemis, that's lovely. But I think for women, I don't think it's as much of a problem when we talk about, although, like I said, like this is a generalization, but when we
Mm.
talk about a dark goddess protecting us, I think uh, I would feel safer that way.
Perhaps I need to use a different term. Not not a dark goddess, but a very powerful, effective goddess, like you say, protector, someone who's able to protect.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that she's called savior
Mm,
is very interesting to me, because technically, as a Christian, you grew up savior is Jesus, right?
mm,
But the fact that she is prayed to as savior, so again, she's saving people. She
yeah.
kills people, yeah. I mean, we don't want
Well,
to
yeah,
sugarcoat it,
yeah,
but she's also seen as savior. And so, yeah, I think she needs to be intense because when you're in childbirth and you don't know if you're going to live or die or your child's going to live or die, you want to call out to a goddess that's going to come and handle
yeah,
business.
yeah, yeah,
And I think that's part of my fascination with her is that the more I dig, the more I find layers to her.
yeah.
And then I have to sort of reimagine and rethink the way even I had thought about her for so long, you
Mm.
know.
I had a question about her relationship because we've obviously got her very much couched within her relationship with women. What was her relationship with men? Oh, obviously we've seen the instance at Sparta. Were there any other ways that there was interaction with men? You mentioned that Brawn, there could have been male initiations going on as well. Is
Hmm.
there?
Hmm. So
Yeah.
there's many, and Pausanias can attest to this and does attest to this. Sorry, there's many instances where men are actually the primary builders of or establishers of temples to Artemis. So she actually speaks to men, and this may be a social, cultural, historical thing where men were the builders, and they
Mm.
say Artemis speaks there. But there are many instances where men are building the temple or inspired by her to build
Right.
temples. There are many instances where men are inspired or saved by her, either in battle or just in
Mm.
traveling. And then they build a temple to her in honor of her. I don't think that Artemis denies men in any way other than those that trespass on her
Yeah.
private space,
Yeah.
right? But I think there are many worshippers of Artemis. I mean, like I said, the ancient Greek men worshipped goddesses without the fear of
Yeah.
being emasculated, right? Because that wasn't an issue for them at all. That wasn't a thing.
And I suppose the other example was the Spartan army, or rather them sacrificing to Artemis. There's a distinct link there between men in the
Yes.
field and a goddess, which is,
Yes.
I suppose,
And of
understood
course,
as well.
the very purpose of sacrifice is that you gain the god's favor.
Yeah.
And so the
Yeah.
fact that she favors them
Yeah.
in battle, in many battles, again, is this link between her and how and the fact that she also initiates boys, and there are places where boys are initiated. And actually, that story, I wrote that story in my book, where the 300 boys that were taken to be castrated, she was really upset, right? So it's the festival of Elaphoblia. I don't know if you remember it, and that's where they have the little cakes that they eat for her, which are basically little deer cakes. They're super cute and supposedly delicious. And that was for the I haven't had any. And that was for the Samian rescue of those 300 boys. So Herodotus tells the story that the Corinthians had captured 300 sons of this nobility, and they were offering them to be eunuchs.
Oh.
Okay, in the city of Alyatis. And then they were escorting the boys on the way there, and they stopped in Samos. Now, in Samos, there was a huge temple to Artemis, massive temple to Artemis, of course. And the Samians were horrified that these boys were going to be castrated. So who do they turn to protect these prisoner boys? It's Artemis, right? And so what they did is they hid the boys in the temple of Artemis. And then the Corinthians were like, well, that's fine. You can hide them in that temple all you like, but they're going to starve, right? Because you're not going to be able to feed them, right? The Corinthians couldn't enter the sanctuary.
Yeah, I think that's
right?
that's the important point to make. For anyone listening, if you were able to enter a sanctuary, you could not be forcibly removed because it was seen as one of the gravest acts you could do. That's why, in case you're thinking, well, they could just go in and get them. No, they couldn't. But obviously, if you're in a sanctuary, it could be in prison.
That's right. That's right. And so what the Corinthians do is they block all the food from going to the temple.
Yeah.
So they're like, okay, we're going to starve these boys out. And the young men and women in the town of Samos create a dance around the temple in which they hold out cakes.
Ah, okay.
For Artemis. Artemis. So
yeah.
again, the Corinthians didn't dare take the cakes, but I mean, they couldn't bring bags of food, but they brought these little cakes. And so imagine young boys and girls just kind of dancing around, holding cakes out on both their hands around the temple. And the 300 boys that were in the temple would be able to step out and steal the cakes.
Right. Okay.
Right. So this happened for months and months and months until the Corinthians were like, okay, screw it. We're going to give up the boys. And so this is a massive legend at Samos, in which one could argue Artemis not only defends boys, but protects them, especially from, forced castration, which is, And so there are instances in which her temple or her worship plays a key role in saving, let's say, the masculine or men.
I would put it out there as well. That's probably the best myth involving cake. If anyone knows of a better myth that involves cake or baked goods, let me know. I don't know of a better one. I did not know that one. I did not know. And it was annoying because I love cake.
Yes, it's one of my favorites. And I actually looked up, and there's a recipe for these cakes as well.
Really?
Online, yes. And they're like they're like a little bit like honey cakes.
Okay,
so
send me the link.
Delicious.
I'm going to put that in the episode notes. If you send me the link to that, I will put that in the episode notes, and you can try them out. Lovely.
Yeah. So that's one of my favorite myths because it's so strategic and smart, and yet it involves, of course. So obviously the Corinthians, who are quite an impressive culture, did not dare step into the sanctuary.
No.
Did not dare stop this dance that they were doing in honor of her, and eventually gave up their prisoners, they returned, or the Sameans returned the boys back to their home. So the boys
Hmm.
went home after and they were free. But it's a great story. It's a great story,
That
and
is good, and it's kind of nice as well because we're coming towards the end of the episode, and it was going down a place of bloodied statues,
right.
general unpleasantness. So it's nice to sort of end it, as it were, on cakes.
Yes.
I'm going to finish up with a question.
Okay.
What are the misconceptions about Artemis? What do you think they are?
So my two pet peeves are her virginity, the constant, and her age.
Yeah.
And so I can get around the virginity a little bit because, she doesn't have children, so it's not really
Mhm.
an issue about that. But I would like for people to know that she could have had a sexual life. And in
Mm.
fact, there's a lot of modern scholars that are looking at her sort of just having an intimate relationship with women. And perhaps she just didn't want
Oh.
to have intimate relationships with men
Mhm.
because she's always surrounded with her female companions and very possessive
Oh.
of her female companions, and even punishes some of them for having relationships with men. Now, in the old sort of religious traditions, they saw this as, oh, they're breaking their virginity. But there are some new suggestions that maybe she's just jealous that those are her
Okay.
lovers,
Yeah.
right? So the fact that she's a virgin, in quotation marks, does not mean that she's not a sexual being,
Yeah.
let's say, or
Yeah.
divinity. So that's my first one. But I would say the one that really I would take away is just her age.
Yeah.
Like, I know we call her a maiden, but a maiden can be a 25-year-old or
Yeah.
27
Yeah.
year old.
Yeah.
Even a 30-year-old, I mean, these are gods, right? So
Mm.
I I don't mind, and again, nothing against anybody who feels like, so there's a young person that feels like they connect to her in that
Mm.
youth way. I think that's wonderful, but I just don't want her to be limited to that. That kind of irks me sometimes. And I guess the last one would be the frolicking, in the
Yeah.
sense that I don't mind the frolicking in the sense, I think we all like to frolic in
Yeah.
the forest every now and then. So again, it's not, I guess it's not, it's just the limitations around her. I feel like she's really it's just now that people are really starting to dig into her more and learning that she's more
Mm.
complex than what we originally thought. So I think the limitations placed around her, I find it a little frustrating sometimes to go through museum after museum after museum and see the same image with her reaching for an arrow with
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
stag, or I
Yeah.
love the image. It's wonderful. We're happy to have them, but there were other depictions of her that we so far have not found, or
Mm.
maybe are lost. And I think that would have given us a more complex sort of idea of her, a more full bodied idea of how she was worshipped.
I think that what you've been able to share on this podcast has given, I think there'll be many people who are listening and probably haven't realized and welcomed the idea that she has much more of a wider depiction, characterization. She's much more of a fuller entity than just the one type. I didn't know it as much. I expected to find that she was layered. I expected to find her as a different character, a different entity. I didn't realize how different. I think that was the thing that I found the most fascinating. And again, because how well you deal with it in your book, she isn't just this one type of character. And I think that's really important. So I think if there's one thing that you can take away, would be what you've just spoken about, the fact that she's not just this sort of teenage girl sort of frolicking in the woods with a
Hmm.
bow and arrow and a friendly and sort of comedic animal giving wisecracks. She's much
Hmm.
more than that. There's an entire backstory there that is far more interesting. Far more interesting.
Yes. Yes. Yes, I think you've summed that up really brilliantly. I think I think that's what the bears in my dream is, in the sense that
We're not going
she's
on dreams now because I just about forgot the nightmarish things that I will have to endure now. So yeah, thanks for that.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
well, look, I just want to say I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and speak as you have done on Artemis. Again, if you're going to find the notes to this, they'll have all the links, including the cake.
yes.
I'm definitely going to try that cake. It will go horribly wrong, but I'm going to give it a go.
Hmm.
And that's all on ancientblogger.com. Find all the links there. Um, I would love to have you on again, but I appreciate you have your own podcast, and therefore you've
Oh,
probably got a great deal of
yeah,
it. But perhaps
no,
when you've
no.
done the book on Ephesus, we can talk about
Yes,
bees. Uh,
yes.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Yes, I don't think that intellectual discussions need to be limited. I would love to we could talk about all kinds of things, and we can do it both on yours and mine. It's really fun,
Just
you
not
know.
dreams. No more dreams.
Just not dreams.
That's
Because
not.
sometimes when you talk by yourself and you're presenting something, it's fun, but when you're having a conversation with someone else, you're like, "Oh,
Oh
yes,
yeah,
exactly."
totally.
You're
It's
yes.
I predominantly do my stuff solo, and it's
Mhm.
at points it's fun. It's always fun. Otherwise, I
Yes.
wouldn't do it because I'm not doing it for the money and the fame.
Right.
Yeah, but
Exactly.
when you get to talk to people, you can have a. It can be a bit different, and it's
Yes.
nice, and it's
It's welcomed.
it
Yes,
is
exactly.
welcomed, particularly when you're
Yes.
throwing ideas around. You can be far more
Yes.
forgiving when we're having a discussion with people
Yes.
when about this sort of thing. And again,
Yes.
if you've taken the time to listen to this, because I realise it's coming up now. I don't know. I'll probably edit this down a bit, but you've spent, I would say, well over an hour listening to us. I really appreciate taking time because there are so many podcasts at the moment that are out there that people are saying, listen to this and listen to this. If you like this, please leave a review if you can do so, and also check out Dr. Ionescu's podcast as well and leave a review when you can. Um, I will say my goodbyes and thanks again for everyone listening. Thanks again, Dr. Ionescu. Really
Thank you
appreciate
so much. Thank you, everyone.
your expertise. And until next time, I'd say sweet dreams, but have better cake.